Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Board Gaming Doctor. My name is Phil, and I'll be your Board Game Doctor today. In this episode, I go over my first impressions of Harmonies. This is a 2024 game designed by Johan Benvenuto, art by Maeva da Silva, published by Libby Lud, and it plays in 30 to 45 minutes, a game for 1 to 4 players. Its weight is a 2.05 out of 5, and overall, despite it being a new 2024 game, is already at 687 overall for ranking. As a quick overview of what this game is about, this game has you placing tiles onto a tableau, creating environments and habitations for animals to live in, fulfilling objectives for tiles that you place, as well as fulfilling objectives depicted on animal cards. You play until you've filled all but 2 of your spaces on your own board, or the bag of tiles is emptied. The player with the most points wins. So to highlight some of these mechanisms and elaborate further, first the tile placement. There are a handful of different environment tiles that you can play on the board, such as buildings, forests and trees or treetops, fields, mountains, etc. Some of these tiles have multiple layers that can be placed on top of each other, such as mountains, and you can build up trees with the trunks and canopy tops as high as potentially 3. And some can only be 1 tile tall, such as the fields and the rivers. Buildings can be placed on top of other building tiles, so you would have 2 buildings on top of each other, or you can place a building tile on top of a mountain or tree trunk tile as well. Each type of these tiles have different ways to score at the end of the game as well, from how tall they are, how much they are linked to each other, etc. Next, the animal cards. On your turn, not only do you take 3 tiles from a central offering, and you place those tiles, you have the option to take 1 of 2 actions. You can either take an animal card from a market row, or you can fulfill as many objectives that you have from animals that you've already taken into your tableau, and you have, as long as you fulfill their criteria, you can achieve as many of them as you can. You can have up to 4 animals at a time in front of you, and each time you fulfill all of the number of objectives a certain amount of times on an animal, you flip it over, creating more space for another animal to go and occupy, and for additional objectives for you to try to fulfill during the game. Additionally, you can play with a more advanced module where you start the game with 1 of 2 spirit animals. You choose 1, and you only have to fulfill its objective once. And all of these animal objectives are basically tile arrangements and certain patterns. And if you fulfill the pattern for this silver animal, spirit animal, you get an additional victory point supply at the end of the game, so you have additional end-game objectives to try to fulfill as well. Let's go into some game comparisons. So first, I think the number 1 game that people compare this to is Cascadia. Cascadia is the number 1 abstract game on Board Game Geek when you filter by abstract games, and it's in the top 100. And this game is quite comparable to Harmonies, which has already achieved the number 7 spot at the time of this recording. Both games feature some similarities in mechanisms, like tile and card drafting, tableau building. I do think they approach these mechanisms a little bit differently, and more on that later, about how I feel about them, but Cascadia has dual drafting of animal and environment tiles together. Harmonies separate and include more of an optional gathering of animal cards, as well as choosing to achieve some of the patterns and fulfill some of the patterns that they have on them as well. The tableau that you build in Cascadia is boundless. You can go in whichever direction you can, whereas in Harmonies it's limited to the board in front of you, a certain amount of tiles that you can play onto that, with the option to elevate from the 1 tile thick level. I think both games have similarities to how they score as well. You have 2 major ways to score in each game, with the environment tiles in both games having either area majority or special rules for how they are scored, and the animal cards with their unique ways to score. There is a push and pull to what you focus on in each game. Perhaps one might argue that it is equally or perhaps more important to focus on creating large corridors of environments in Cascadia versus scoring for animals, or vice versa. You could probably argue the same in Harmonies for scoring your tiles that you've placed, as well as the patterns that you form to score animals. Which is important, or more important rather, time will tell, and perhaps people who play both games and are more expert at these games will have more of an established opinion about this. The next game is Azul. The mechanism of drafting a coaster full of tiles is somewhat similar in both games, and this is probably the number 2 game that people compare this Harmonies to. You can't always plan ahead too greatly in both games due to the drafting nature of taking tiles from the coasters. However, in Azul, you have the option to gather from the middle of the tile types that aren't discarded, and so there is a little bit more of a planning ahead aspect in Azul versus the constant refilling nature of Harmonies, where you automatically refill the coaster that had been taken from, thus renewing the options for each player at the beginning of their turn. And so the draft portion feels more important and is probably the base mechanism that is Azul, which makes sense, but in Harmonies it leads to the scoring opportunities and perhaps is not as forefront as drafting is in Azul. Next is Tiny Towns. Now, the tightness of the tableau that you build on feels very much like the limited format that you have in Tiny Towns when I played Harmonies, albeit with more room to breathe in Harmonies compared to Tiny Towns, as the board is much smaller in Tiny Towns. Scoring is kind of similar as well. You're trying to arrange different colored cubes in Tiny Towns to form shapes and patterns that will allow you to put a building onto your board, closing off that space, but allowing you to score in a unique way that is dissimilar from game to game. The buildings may be the same, but the way that they score is different. So it's a comparison to Cascadia in that regard. But regardless, in both games, you have a limited format for which to play tiles, and thus the decisions start to get very agonizing very soon as you start to run out of room. The last game that I want to compare this to is Acropolis. One of the first games that I played with the ability to place tiles on top of each other was Acropolis, and I liked that mechanism because it allows for flexibility due to the randomness of what tiles may be available to draft. But it also gives that tough decision to either continue with your current strategy or to pivot and try something new with what is available. And making that pivot easier is the ability to place things on top of each other, and that's something that I really enjoyed in both games. Here I'll briefly mention that there are some other games that people compare this to Harmonies, and Reef was probably the one game that most people had mentioned. It is another tile placing layered type of game that came out in 2018, so there are some similarities there, and perhaps one day I will discover for myself what those similarities are. Let's go on to the peer review. So this game for praise hits the spot for many players with the balance of a quick and easy teach with a deeper strategy that lies within, similar to games mentioned before in the game comparisons. Playtime feels pretty right for what the box says, 30 to 45 minutes. A game can conclude around that time, even at higher player counts. The art is great, and the tile placing rules feel unique and thematic to the game, more so with the theme of the tiles themselves, and how they score. The mountains need to be linked together to score points. The river needs to touch one another and form a physical river in order to do so. So theme, in that regard, is what I think people mean. I haven't played this game solo yet, but people mention that it works pretty well. But speaking of the solo mode, some concerns that folks had was that you are constantly refilling the coasters with tiles, which can kind of really slow down play if you're having to make sure that you have 3 tiles on the coasters every time you take a turn. It's easier when you're in a multiplayer setting to do so because you have more hands around the table to potentially help out with that upkeep from round to round. There are some issues with the card quality in the physical version and the component production for some as well. There isn't much interaction other than drafting cards or tiles away from other players. Perhaps those players find games like Azul or even Cascadia a little bit more interactive, as the drafting in that game has potentially more of an impact to scoring at the end of the game. A lot of people ultimately don't find that this game, Harmonies, does not stand out uniquely enough from games like Cascadia to feel it has a place on their shelf. So my first impressions, and to preface this, I have played one multiplayer game with 4 people, and I'm happy to say that even including the teach, we played this game within an hour. versus, I mean, I know the game says it takes about 30 to 45 minutes. I will say that the game probably took about 45 minutes max with 4 people. I want to say that my plays of other games like Cascadia took longer when you included the teach and the actual gameplay. And I believe both games have the same amount of time listed on the box. So I liked the pacing of Harmonies, and briefly mentioned before in the overview, but the game, the way that it ends is either you have 2 spots on someone's tableau that are empty, everything else is filled up, which triggers, the end of the game. Everyone takes enough turns to make it equal amongst all the players, or if the bag runs out of tiles to refill. And in our game, that happened in the same cycle of turns, naturally, and so that I felt was a great way to end the game, and it felt like it, once again, had a good cadence to it. The strategy of this game is interesting, because with our play, some focused on scoring their tableau, versus others who focused more on scoring the animal cards that they had gathered for themselves. I think you need to do both successfully to win, but it seems like you could get away with a lot of points equally for both, since all of our scores were within 10 points of each other, and so it seems pretty balanced. And so those who are looking for good strategies, it appears that you need to be opportunistic and find the tile offerings as well as the animals that are offered to find the best and most efficacious strategies and combinations of both tiles and animal cards to win. Now, I own Azul, and I do own Cascadia and Tiny Towns as well, and I do agree with some that this game isn't the most innovative in this game space and for this weight, rules complexity. And perhaps that's not the intention. I believe it was the intention of the designer and publisher to make a game that is within this genre and subgenre of family weight abstract tile layers. Maybe this game is just a culmination of some great mechanisms with some slight tweaks to make it feel a little bit different amongst these other giants of games like Cascadia and Azul that are already on the market. And I enjoy all of those games for what they are, and I really did enjoy this game as well. Since this game felt so familiar and similar to Cascadia and Azul, I personally find my score for both of these games very much at the same level. I would say that I could grab any of these games equally off the shelf and still have a good time with gamers who enjoy the hobby very much so and are aware of some perhaps more complex games, as well as gamers who are more casual in nature and, with a quick rules teach and intriguing gameplay. That was the case with Harmonies when I played this. I played this game with some friends who aren't in as deep as I am into the hobby, and they really enjoyed it as well. And so this game obviously is a hit across the board for gamers, hardcore gamers and casual gamers alike. And so for me, if I had to rank any of these, even though perhaps my score on Board Game Geek would probably be the same for any of these games, if I had to rank them in a personal list, I am still fresh from playing Harmonies and have really enjoyed my play of it, but I also want to state that I did play Cascadia 2 days after I played Harmonies. It was not planned at all. It just happened to be at a gathering that I was a part of. And so I got to experience Cascadia again, and this is the base game. I have looked into Cascadia landmarks as well. I am intrigued about what that module adds to the game, not necessarily the 5 and 6 player additional tiles and things like that, but the fact that you are trying to arrange animals or tiles in environmental corridors together to achieve different objectives during the game and place those tiles on top of your board, the tableau that you build in Cascadia, seems really intriguing, and I do need to try that out. But the point that I'm trying to make is that Cascadia, now with landmarks, Azul, you look at all of the support that Azul has had, mostly in the terms of additional content, standalone content and sequels that it's had, but you can look at the chocolate version that is on Board Game Arena, for example, which tweaks around some rules that you can play with the base game to make it feel a little bit different with how you draft tiles and how you assign them when you choose a certain coaster and things like that. There has been enough time for Cascadia and Azul to develop into their own unique play styles by interacting with the seemingly similar mechanisms that all of these games share with tile placement and drafting. And I feel like those games have their own unique identity, whereas Harmonies comes out as a base game that is pretty solid. I think it obviously shares a lot of the same mechanisms, but it hasn't gotten that identity yet. I think it probably will be poised to have additional content made for it, which will give it more of an identity. So I do have to take that into context as well. I personally play Azul a lot more than any of these other games, mostly because I play with family on Board Game Arena, and so it's hard for me to downgrade Azul despite its simplicity, and this is base Azul as well. And so I still hold that in high regard. I think it's a very elegant and very approachable game, not only for a casual gamer, but there is a lot of strategy that can be seen in that game. And so I hold that somewhat apart from Harmonies and Cascadia and want to focus in a little bit more on those two. I feel like the interaction is a little bit higher in Cascadia, with the drafting being more central to what you're trying to accomplish. The dual drafting of the environment tiles and the animal tokens that you're placing onto your tableau, it seems like you can get into other people's ways in a more impactful way compared to Harmonies. I felt like in Harmonies that despite some tiles or a collection of tiles on the coaster being taken by someone else ahead of me could have been detrimental, I always found another solution that was pretty much equal. It felt equal to me. Maybe it wasn't if you crunch the numbers, but I didn't feel impacted as much as I did in Cascadia. And so, yes, Harmonies does feel a little bit more solo-oriented or multiplayer solitaire compared to Cascadia, but I do really appreciate the actual puzzle that you're solving with the tiles and Harmonies, more so than in Cascadia. I like the layering options. They kind of push your luck element of how high can I get my trees or mountains before I call it quits and try to score something else. And I really liked that aspect of it. And I really felt like Harmonies played a lot faster as well, because I don't know if this is true. I didn't double check, but maybe there are less tiles in Harmonies to play around with. Maybe there are more in Cascadia. It just felt like Cascadia, it feels like a longer game compared to Harmonies. And so I do appreciate Harmonies a little bit more for that. And so I appreciate the puzzle more in Harmonies despite the lack of interaction, or the lesser interaction that you have compared to Cascadia. With that, plus the cadence of the game and how fast it plays compared to Cascadia, I think I enjoy it more. And this is completely anecdotal. I think people who play Cascadia a lot more than I do are a lot faster at it. And if I played with more folks who were more familiar with the game, yeah, we could easily get that time frame closer to Harmonies and have them be about equal. But for now, I think I would reach for Harmonies because of those aspects, as well as because it's a newer game and it feels fresher. But time will tell. Once these identities start to continue to evolve, as perhaps more content and expansions are added to Harmonies, maybe it'll feel different, whether it's beneficial or not in the future as both of these games are compared. And yeah, time will tell. So hopefully that all made sense, and appreciate you spending time and consulting with me today. Hopefully you schedule an appointment with us real soon, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.